It's the 10th of June, I believe, 2016. This is Tommy Lofton. I'm here in the studio at the World War II Museum. Uh, First, if you would, could you give me your name, sir?
Arthur Scharlau.
All right, Mr. Scharlau, can you tell me your date of birth?
March the 2nd, 1927.
All right, and where were you born? Where did you grow up?
In Chicago.
Really?
And lived there until in the early 1930s, 31, 32, and finally we moved to Miami, Florida in 1934. My parents lost everything in the Depression, and they had a house, a summer cottage, and they lost both of them and put everything we owned in the car and drove down to Miami, Florida. I had an uncle living down there, and I don't know if he got my dad a job or what the reason was or how it came about. As young as I was, they didn't talk about it.
What do you remember of that journey? How long did it take?
I have no idea. But we made 4 trips from Chicago, and in 1934, my dad got a job at doing something at the World's Fair. At the time, he was an awning hanger on Miami Beach, and we think he got a job through the company there, but we're not sure. But we went to Chicago and stayed in my aunt's father's farmhouse near O'Hare Airport in Chicago. Of course, O'Hare Airport wasn't there at that time. And we were in a old farmhouse that had no running water, had a cistern to catch rainwater for dishes and clothes, and we'd get the drinking water and cooking water out of a fire hydrant on Higgins Road.
A lot different from today.
Yes, but when we moved to Miami, we were in the same boat. We had no running water, no electricity. My dad had a house built, and my brother and I don't know what happened, but whether my folks couldn't pay for it or whether the man left or what, but he quit before he finished building the house. And the whole house was 4 rooms, and it was the exact same size, square foot, as my master bedroom is today, 4,400 feet. And that was the whole house. And of course, we had no heat, no kitchen, no stove in the kitchen. Got a kerosene stove eventually, and then we had cows, chickens, and grew up like a farmer or like a Okie back in those days.
Well, tell me about life growing up like that. What was that like for you?
Frankly, thinking back about it, there's a lot of memories that today are beautiful because my parents could not afford to buy toys or anything for us. So my dad I always refer to him as a dumpster diver. And he would find things or create things for my brother and I to play with. We got a lot of one-on-one time with my dad and my mother because of the situation. We had chickens, and I would deliver eggs and get a nickel tip, and that was a big deal. We sold our cow's milk, which was raw milk back then, for 12 cents a quart. And it was enough to keep us going. I don't ever remember being hungry, but I remember a lot of fun, and almost all the kids used to like to come to our house because it was so different than the average house. My folks would grow anything to feed us. Frankly, that's about it, just trying to get enough food to feed us. And it was, I don't know, I think it was good. I think these kids today are missing a lot that I had, and I probably didn't like it back then because I wasn't as good as the others. But I shouldn't say not as good, but we didn't have the facilities or the money. But I don't remember any of my friends complaining about having to go out in outhouse or anything. I can remember a buddy of mine and I, about 12 years old, we'd go pick cucumbers, and what we would do was get all the cucumbers left in the field and pay, I want to say, a nickel a dozen or a dime a dozen, and then we go to the high-rent district of Coral Gables, Florida, which is a nice area, and sell them at the front door. We knock on the front door and sell them 3 for a dime. And how could they turn some kid down at the front door? It's like these brownies when they sell the Girl Scout cookies. How do you turn them down? But and it gave us change. At 12, I joined the Sons of the American Legion because my dad was in the Legion, and he only joined so that I could be in the Sons of the Legion. I was in the Drum and Bugle Corps. But my mother and dad would give me a quarter on Saturday morning. My buddy and I would ride our bicycles over to this place, a friend of ours, and park them behind his apartment house. Then we would go to a movie, that was a dime, and we had a nickel for a candy bar. And then at lunchtime, his dad owned a restaurant, and he would feed us. And then a dime would take us, we could catch a bus and go to the American Legion home and drill and play ball and what have you. And then the guy that lived where we parked our bicycles would take us back there, and for a quarter, we had a whole Saturday straightened out. It was great. I wonder if it was as great then as it is now, in my memories.
I understand. Tell me, what were your high school years like? What did you do for fun? And I guess take me a little closer to the war.
In high school, I played football, of course. Who doesn't play football in high school? I went to Miami Senior High School, which was a large, popular school. It had a good name, and it was the football team the largest crowd I played in front of was about 42,000 in a high school game, which is a large crowd. I've read since then there was a game that had 49,000 in it. That's a lot of people, and that's money, and the school really used that money. My brother was captain of the football team before I got over there, and so I used his name. I wrote in on his glory, and that helped considerably because his name was known. And then when I come up, in fact, there's a couple guys that went to school with me that still call me Bob instead of Art because they got us confused. But it was nice. I had a good high school time. In high school, the war was going on, and we would collect scrap metal, scrap paper, and we had a pile of scrap metal behind the school, at least 2 stories high, loaded with. Well, I can remember going and picking up an automobile someone donated and driving it over there and putting it with the other stuff. Now, it sounds like they're donating a lot, but my aunt bought an automobile from some kids that were repairing them and selling them, and paid either $12 or $15 for it, and those kids made money. So, yeah, it was nice. And then they'd sell stamps, the war stamps and defense stamps and the victory stamps, and it changes according to the way the war was going. When I graduated from high school, we all knew we were going to go into service. It was just natural that we would enlist. And my brother graduated in 1943, and he enlisted. And then I graduated in January 1945, and I joined the Navy within a week of graduation. I really wanted to go in the Army. My dad worked in a shipyard, and he worked there from the beginning of the war, or before we were in the war, with converting personal ships, your yachts, your fishing boats, into naval vessels. And once we were in war, we had a lot of ships being sunk by the German submarines along the East Coast and into the Gulf. And he used to come home with a lot of stories and things, and he'd have these boats that were really beat up. And when they'd bring one in that was in bad shape, they would take all of the food off of it, and where they would put the true sailors, I have no idea, but they would throw the food away. Well, if the food was good, and most of it was still in canned goods and never opened, the employees would divide up what came off the ships and take it home because all the food was rationed. And the one thing, there was two things that I remember getting a lot of, and one was black olives, and the other was canned pears, and he'd bring those home. And the peculiar thing is, the whole time I was in the Navy, I never saw a black olive or a canned pear. But I can remember eating them like mad because they came in gallon cans, and you didn't have refrigeration, so you had to do what you could with it and eat it. When I joined the Navy, I went to Bainbridge, Maryland for boot camp. And in boot camp, it was really easy for me because I had just finished a season of football, so physically I was in good shape. I knew enough about marching from the Sons of the Legion that it gave me enough knowledge where I knew what I was doing. Wasn't good at it, but I knew what I was doing. And then they tried to get you to work together in groups, and they'd have a weekend. You got a flag if you had the most points in your company and what have you. And they talked me into it somehow where I was supposed to prize fight. I was not a fighter. I knew very little about it. Like I say, good physical shape, but not a fighter. And this one guy, I don't remember where he was from, one of my buddies in boot camp, was street smart. And I thought I was street smart until I got in the Navy, and then with these other people, I was dumb as dirt. But he told me, now, just go along with anything I say. Don't question it. Don't say anything. Just go along with it. And we'd get behind the guy that I was going to fight, and he'd start talking about this guy I beat up in a bar the other night. We couldn't even get off the base, and he would talk about, I really clobbered that another guy. And I had dozens of fights according to our conversation. Got into the ring with him, and he was so afraid that I think in the first round he fell down twice. I don't think I touched him. And I think in the second round he tripped on a shoelace or something, and they stopped it as a technical knockout. So I got 100% wins in the ring, and I never got back in. But it was odd when you come up with those things. The first night in the Navy, they issued us a bunk while they were trying to figure what to do with us, and they took, somebody stole my wallet, and in my wallet I had my dad's gasoline coupons. My dad never said anything about it. I had to write him and tell him I did. I'd lost them, and I really felt bad about it, but he never said anything, and never did find out. They found my wallet, but they never. I had probably $20 in it, which back then was a lot of money, and the gas coupons. I finished basic training. They had given a lot of tests to see what school you'd go to, and here again, my education wasn't up to snuff, as they say. They offered me fire control school, which is firing your shipboard guns, or quartermaster. Well, quartermaster in the Army is more or less bookkeepers or issuing stuff, whereas in the Navy it's steering the ship. And consequently, I didn't want to be a bookkeeper, so I went ahead and told them fire control school. It was a doggone good school, a good education, electric, mechanical, and all that. And anyhow, when I finished it, the rumors were I was going to catch a ship out of somewhere on the East Coast. I don't remember where. And I wrote home. We didn't have a telephone at home, and my mother sent me, I think, another $20 so I could come home on leave and then go catch the ship. Well, I got to spend that money in Honolulu. I never did get near the East Coast, which is normal for service. Anyhow, when I left, I caught a troop transport from the Bainbridge after the fire control school. And by the way, I had my boot leave, and that was the only leave I had while I was on active duty in the Navy. And traveled out to, can't even think of a receiving station in California. Can't remember the name of it. And I was there about a week or 10 days. And the biggest thing I remember is they did not have toilet paper. And when they finally got toilet paper, the men would go through the barracks yelling they had toilet paper, and everybody would run and get a roll for themselves because they never had it. And I never ran into that anywhere else but there. After about a week or 10 days there, I went over to Treasure Island, which had a fence 15, 20 foot tall, no telephones, no mail. It was during the war, when you're going to ship out, you couldn't sneak any information. Well, the war was over. I think the war was over. My timing on it is really confused. Anyhow, I was in there less than 24 hours, and then they put me on a escort carrier, which was a small carrier, and as a passenger. And there was about 30 or 40 of us as passengers on it. And there were some beautiful scenes of the flying fish and porpoises and everything. But there was no work, no detail, nothing to do but sit and look, and it gets boring after a while. And a big issue was that every afternoon about 4 o'clock, the engines would stop. They would clear the aft end of the flight deck, and the captain and I believe it was a warrant officer, would go back there and skeet shoot for about an hour, and then the engines would crank up and they'd go again. We got to Hawaii, and again they put me in a receiving station at Aiea, which is a suburb of Honolulu, and there was, again, no work, nothing to do, and you couldn't go back to your hut after about 8 or 8:30 in the morning until lunchtime. You could clean up a little, and then you could not go back in until after 4 or 4:30, something like that. And you could sit in the street in the sun, or you could go to the beer garden. And the part that still gets me, and if you were in the beer garden and you weren't drinking a beer, the shore patrol would put you out on the street. And that's where I learned how to drink beer. You either drink it or sit out in the street and be awful. They lined about, well, I shouldn't say lined us up, but they got about 30 or 40 of us together one day, and they issued us empty boxes and told us to send home our dress uniforms, our hammock, and leave the mattress there. Back then, you had mattresses issued to you. Well, when we left Hawaii, we couldn't take our mattresses with us. They kept them. And why we were supposed to send our uniforms home, I still don't make any sense out of it. And we got on the, I was lined up waiting to go aboard the Bonhomme Richard, which is a carrier, a large carrier, as a passenger with some of these same men. And by the way, when I went in, I was a kid, but I grew up in a hurry, became a man. I was sitting there and I asked somebody where the ship was going, and they said it's going to Guam. Well, I knew my brother was on Guam, and that's another thing that I'm still confused about. We knew where everybody was, all our buddies, we knew what ships they were on, but I don't know how we got the information around, but we knew what was going on. And I sat down and wrote a letter to my brother and told him that I was getting aboard the Bonhomme Richard. And I knew he repaired planes from the carriers, so he would know what was going on. Anyhow, the trip from Hawaii out to Guam was another one of those, no work, nothing to do, beautiful sights on the ocean, but boring as all get out. And we got to Guam, and I could see the beauty in Guam because South Florida, you got the palm trees and all that. Well, in the Pacific, you got the palm trees, coconut palms and all this. And the only difference was they had the mountains there. And to me, I could see the beauty in it. Anyhow, I went sitting back by my bunk, just waiting to, next thing, someone to tell me what to do. And over the PA, it came, Seaman Arthur Scharlau report to the quarterdeck. I didn't know what a quarterdeck was. And in school, it was the table up at the end of the barracks, but I didn't know anything. I finally found it, and there my brother was standing. He had, he would take Japanese 37 millimeter shells, and he was a lathe operator, and he'd cut them down and put a flange on them. His buddy would, in the plating shop, would plate them, and they'd swap them 6 for a case of beer to the officers. And he had rented a captain's gig with a case of beer to come out to the Bonhomme Richard to see me. And he stayed there with me until we went ashore, and we climbed down a cargo net into a LCVP. He climbed down with me, went ashore with me, and we got into a truck. First of all, that's the first LCVP I had ever seen. I'd never seen one before. And the second one I saw is here in the museum. And I hadn't seen another one since, other than this one. Anyhow, my brother would tell me where we're going. Well, we get there, we'd pass it. Well, no, you're going to the sub base. We'd pass it. He says, I don't have any idea where they're taking you. And the island's only 30 miles long and 20 miles wide or something. I mean, it's a small island, and he still couldn't figure it. They took me to a small area that had tents, and like I say, there was 30, 40 of us, and had us lined up. They called a roll to make sure we were all there. And they didn't have any commissioned officers. There was 2 enlisted men, 2 petty officers. And they said, you need a helmet, a mess kit, and a canteen. Well, we'd have to go out into the field and find one, the cleanest we could find. They didn't issue them, which in service school, everything's done by the book. Well, here, they didn't have any books. And then they said, go pick a tent. Well, we went and found a tent that, how do you know what to do picking a tent? And there was 6 cots in each one. Well, the Navy carried their own mattresses. They took our mattresses in Hawaii, so we got a canvas cot with no mattress to sleep on. And then they would put us on perimeter watches and patrols and what have you, and you had a choice between a 45 caliber pistol or a carbine, and you didn't check them out. You just took what you wanted. None of us had ever seen them. We had much less fired one, and it was odd. They asked if anybody in there, do they have a cook in there? Well, 90% of the people in there just came out of boot camp, and then there was the 10% of us that had been in fire control, or not in fire control, but in service school. We had nobody there that really knew anything, and so they says, "Does anybody cook?" One kid said he cooked, and says, "Okay, you're the cook," and he lied because he could take a piece of Spam and cremate it on one side and have it raw on the other. In other words, he didn't turn it over, he just burned one side until it got hot. The coffee he made was delicious. He would put a bag of beans, he had a GI can on one of the stoves. He'd put a bag of beans, coffee beans in there and boil it. Then the next morning he would take that bag of beans out and put another bag in and then fill it up to where it was full again. Only once a week did he empty what was left in there. And by Friday or whatever the day was, your spoon would stand up straight in it. It was swell. We had helmets welded to pipes for the urinals, and the toilets. It was about an 8 or a 10 holer, and now this is my thinking. I don't know for sure, but I think they were putting quicklime in to eat the feces up, and then if you went too soon, the fumes would burn your fanny. And then the next day they would wash it down with diesel oil so that no bugs would be there, and if you went, your fanny would be burned. We all wore fatigues. If you had dungarees, you wore them, but it didn't matter. And we had baseball caps, we had helmets, we had whatever you wanted to wear, you could wear. And then we would go on work details with the Marines, and sometimes we would go on patrol with the Marines, and they were more afraid of us than the Japs, because the Japs knew what to do with the rifle. We didn't know. Anyhow, I was at my brother's base at the Orodi, and went to lunch with him, and he had an onion about the size of half a dollar, a fresh onion. That was a treat. And he peeled it, and he divided it among about 4 or 5 of us, and I mean, it tasted good. Within a week or 2, I was at the Marine base. Somehow, I was in their warehouse, and I saw a sack of onions, and I filled my blouse up with these onions and took them to my brother, and he still would only take one onion at a time and divide it among people. He didn't want anyone to think that he was affluent with onions and kept his name up. Short time after that, I was at the Marine base, and I saw a box of raisins, and I had to have the raisins. I mean, let's face it, why did they put them there if they didn't put them for me to take? And it was in a wooden crate, and I don't know what I was doing, but I was having difficulty getting into it. And I remember somehow some of the guys, my buddies, were laughing. Well, when I finally got the box of raisins out, it's either the mess sergeant or the cook from the Marines had been watching me, and he made me go swab down the galley in the Marine base. And after I finished, I went and got my raisins and took them home. I still don't remember what I did with them, but I had to have those raisins. I think I'm about the only swabby that did KP in a Marine base, but at least I got something out of it. we would drive up into the mountains on marine trucks, but there was work details, but I don't remember doing any work. I remember patrols, but I don't remember the work. The war was over at that time, actually, and it's hard to visualize. The average person doesn't realize it, but a lot of your Japanese soldiers did not give up when the war was over. And they would, there was a lot of skirmishes, a lot of snipers, and they would get in line, in chow line with some of our bases. They would have our uniforms on, stealing them somewhere, and they would get in line trying to get food, and they were hungry, and they would, sometimes they get caught, and sometimes they wouldn't, but I've read where 20-some years after, they still were finding a few of them floating around. Anyhow, I got no mail at all. My parents knew I was okay because I was writing home. My brother was writing, and they would send us each packages, particularly at Christmas time, fruitcakes, and mine would go back home again because they didn't know where I was, they said, and my brother would get it. Well, I'd go over there for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's, and I remember having fruitcake and beer with them, and it was great. I mean, let's face it. While I was in the tent area, which was in Barrigada, which is the center of the island, my brother brought over two baseball gloves and a baseball, and that was the complete amount of equipment, sporting equipment that we had to play with, and it went over huge. I mean, it was a big deal to those people, including me, don't get me wrong. Finally got a letter. One letter came in, and it was a Dear John, which I don't know how I reacted then. She was a sweet girl. She was a senior in high school, and there was no reason for her to stay home and not go to the prom and all that stuff. So I hope I didn't make a fool out of myself, but I don't really recall how I acted. But after the war, I got a letter from her mother saying she got married. I ought to write her. And, why? Anyhow, right after January, about the 5th or 6th of January, 1946, I got transferred to NOB Guam, which until then I was still in my records stationed in a receiving station in California. According to when I wrote in for my records, I hadn't left the States yet. And anyhow, I reported there. I could type, and they put me in a dispersing office, which was good because I could handle it. And then when they saw my penmanship, they weren't happy with it, but when they found out I could type, they put me handling mileage and per diem claims for officers, and both of them fit my personality and my education, and I could do a decent job with that, and it got to be fun. While we were there, one kid, when we weren't doing something, we would go in and get somebody's service record and see what was in it. And one of the kids that was with us, we got his, and in it, when he enlisted, his father, he was 17, so his father had to sign for him, and his father put in there that he should, wanted him to be either in the United States Navy or United States Naval Reserve, which it had to be one or the other instead of or. And so a couple of us sat down and wrote a letter that his father thought that he was joining the reserves. And of course the war was over, so no big deal. And then we sent it to the legal office, and the legal office rewrote it. And then he got orders for the first immediate available transportation. He should report back to the United States for immediate discharge. And I'd been on Guam longer than he'd been in the Navy. And he went, phew! But it's one of those things that was comical, sometimes pathetic. Anyhow, going back to my brother, he was getting ready to leave and go back to for discharge, go back to the States for discharge. And I went over to his base to say goodbye to him. I couldn't find him. And I went to his hut, and there was his clothes laying there and his sea bag, and the sea bag was open. And then it came over the PA where they were, the bus was waiting on Petty Officer Robert Scharlau. So I packed his clothes, locked his sea bag, carried his sea bag, threw it on the bus, and then I went and found him. Well, the clothes I packed was what he was going to wear home. So he had to go steal clothes off a clothesline in order to have something to get off the base, because neither of us had guts enough to tell the driver to get his sea bag off the bus. And we were talking about that recently, and I wonder if we thought it was that humorous back then as we do now. Anyhow, when it was time for me to leave and come back to the States for discharge, I had my orders changed. I wanted to get discharged in Alaska, go to University of Alaska, and I wrote and told my dad what I was going to do. And my dad wrote back saying, your mother hadn't seen you in about 2 years. I hadn't seen you. You get home. And my dad's parents, or my dad's family, I should say, were not a very close family at all. They didn't hang around each other. They'd go years without even contacting each other, and he knew probably what would happen. Anyhow, so I got my discharge in Jacksonville and went home to Miami.
When was that? Do you remember about the date?
I think it was August 19th, 1946. No. No, have I missed anything?
Where was your basic?
Bainbridge, Maryland.
Okay. I'm going to be sure I had that right. Oh, what did you want to do when you got out of the Navy?
The only thing I knew was to go to college, and I was confused. The whole bunch of us were, and I've talked to some of these guys that were with me then, and they said it took 5-6 years before they could get settled down. And I sometimes wonder if I had this, what is it,
PTS?
Yeah, but in World War II you didn't have it. Unless you're in combat, you had nothing going wrong with you. But sometimes I wonder if I had it, because these other guys sounded feeling the same way I did. But I went to the University of Miami and then decided to open a service station and make $1 million. Didn't do it.
Did you use the GI Bill for college?
Yes.
How was that?
It was a problem for me, and don't get me wrong, I had wonderful parents. My dad had, I think, a 6th grade education, which back then was normal. I mean, it wasn't a big deal. And he could not understand how you could go to school for, say, take 15 hours, and you're supposed to work all those other hours. You didn't need time to go research or what have you. And it was a problem between he and I over, in fact, and my brother, because he never finished college either, because he felt we should be working. And I always had a job while I was going to school, and I never had the feeling of college. When I look at my grandkids, the fun they had out of it, and I really did not have it.
Did you give any consideration or thought to staying in the Navy at any time?
Yes, I did. I joined the reserves, and I didn't care for it. You'd go for a weekend, and so I joined the Air Force Reserve. The Air Force Reserve came up, got on, when Korea broke out, we were put on the alert to be called to active duty, and back then they'd give you a week to 10 days to report for duty. And I was running the service station at that time. I had it, and I knew I would have to sell it in a hurry. So I sold it, and I couldn't get a job because who wants to hire somebody that's on the alert waiting to be called? And I went to join the Army, and went to OCS, and then resigned from OCS because I could get out that way. Now, I still really cannot honestly answer whether I got a discharge from the Army because I didn't like it or because I was planning on it. I don't really know. But I got married while I was in the Army, and that threw a curve to me. The marriage was done in Fort Jackson, and I got married on a Saturday, and we had to watch a parade before we could go get married because we couldn't cross the street to go to the chaplain. And then that was on a Saturday, and Sunday, let's see, Sunday night she left and went back to Miami and was at work with the telephone company, and on Monday morning I was in the field, sleeping in a tent again. But it lasted 58 years.
Okay.
So she tolerated me. I think I messed up on two items. I don't know. One of them is when I got ready to come home, when my brother was leaving, they had taken my dress uniform from me in Hawaii, and I did not have a dress uniform. So I borrowed one from my brother, which had his rate on aviation machinist mate instead of storekeeper, and went home and wore it home. The other thing is, one of the guys with me who had come out of basic training and came out there went home with us, and in Frisco, somehow he got into town without putting his neckerchief on. I think he had his pea jacket on and covered it when he took it off. The Shore Patrol got him and took him to an Army-Navy store and made him buy one. And the funny part about it, to him and me, when he was telling me about it, he didn't know how to tie it because after boot camp, we never wore those uniforms. And he never tied it. Over a year, he never tied a neckerchief. So the Shore Patrol tied his neckerchief for him. Had to help dress him.
What rank were you when you came home from the war?
Third class petty officer.
And what about when you got out of the Army?
Private. I went in as a private for OCS.
Oh, one thing you didn't mention, and I was curious if you talk about it, is Pearl Harbor Day. What do you remember that day?
Got a lot of memories there. Sunday morning, I think my dad was working nights or something, but anyhow, on a Sunday morning, there was one or two of our friends and my brother and my dad was sitting on the sofa in our living room, and he was downhearted. We're at war. And I mean, he was devastated because of it, and he was a mess sergeant in World War I over in in Europe. One part about his story is that he, in World War I, you could join the unit you wanted to go into if they had available space. And he joined the field artillery, and they didn't leave soon enough, so he joined the railroad engineers. And he was either in England or France, and the Army was at his house looking under the bed in the closets because he was AWL from the first outfit he joined. And he had I don't know, I don't remember any of the stories of how he proved that he wasn't. And in 1919, I got a passport, copy of his not a copy, but I got the passport. And he had gotten out of the Army. He went to work as a seaman on a ship. He didn't like it. He jumped ship in London. He got the passport on Christmas Eve from the ambassador in London, and it said for temporary residence in France, good for 2 months, not to be renewed. I had never heard of that before. But they said that when you get one overseas, they don't take the time to research it like they do here, so they can't do it. But when I saw that, not to be renewed, I zoo.
You remember where you were when you found out FDR died?
I was still home then.
Mm.
Yeah, I say I was home then. I don't know.
Just wondering.
Yeah, I know. I mean,
what about the day the war ended? VJ Day. What do you remember that day?
Don't remember it.
Really?
Seriously, I would think I'd remember that, but I don't.
Some people do, some people don't.
Yeah. I got the newspapers where we went to war and where Japan surrendered,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't remember.
Let me ask you this. What's it like coming here to this museum and seeing the artifacts and different things, and do you think it's important that we have museums like this one for future generations?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Going back a little bit, when I read or hear where these countries will tear up old monuments in Europe or in the East and all that, it hurts me because those are history. I don't look at them as to worship them. I look at them as history, and we should save our history stories and our history. I think it's important to the future generations. And thinking back, stories from World War I, we should save those. Like this, I think it's good. Because let's face it, the stories, you hear so many different stories from the Civil War, which is history, and we should hold on to that. And that doesn't mean that you're for the South, for the North, or whatever. That just means it's history. That makes sense?
Yes, sir.
Good.
I guess my last question is, how did the war change you?
Well, I went over as a kid and came back as a man. Went over, the world owed me a living. I came back. It's true, it owes me a living, but I have to work like hell to collect it. It taught me to take orders and to do what I said I'm going to do, or do what I'm supposed to do. And sometimes that's difficult to do. But discipline is the biggest thing that we need in our lives. And we're losing it right now. It's a shame, but we're not handling it well.
I think we've covered about everything, and everything I meant, planned to ask you. Is there anything else you want to add, or I want to thank you for coming in and doing this too.
Oh, I'm glad to do it because, like I say, I think it's good for somebody in the future when somebody starts doing research.
As you said, it's history.
Yes, and my history is so far removed from the average seaman's history because I was at the end of the war. I was in an odd spot. I really do not have some of the dates of when I accomplished things, because whenever I left California until January, it's not listed. And they said I'd have to go get daily reports from everywhere I was to find out when and where I was. And that would be, well, I guess you could do it, but I don't know.
Take some time.
Oh gosh, don't you know it?
Well, thank you for coming in today, and thank you for your service.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate you doing it
It's my
because
pleasure.